In this demonstration, I have an isolate scope with string directive. And what I want to demonstrate is how we can pass a value into the directive, even though it's going to have isolate scope. So let's go ahead and add that first. And we'll add our isolate scope. But I'm going to add a little space this time. And that's because, as you saw earlier, if I just put up the walls, we really can't get anything. And we definitely can't get to a name property that we want to write out. So what I'm going to do is come in and say name and then give it a value. Now, that'll allow us from the outside world, when we use this directive here, to actually come in and define a name attribute on the tag, and then we can pass in a string. That's what the at means. All right, so let's go save that. We'll come back into our index, and let me go ahead and add this in. So we'll add a script reference to isolate scope with string directive. And now that we have that, we can come in and let's just add a new H2 here, and we'll say isolate scope with string, and then we'll type it out. Now this one's a little bit longer, and it's going to be isolate scope with string. And note that the name there, if we go back to the isolate scope with string here, note that it kind of matches up with this name here, but again, we put the dashes. All right, so let's go on back here and we'll save that. Now, if we run it right now, it's not going to do anything because obviously we haven't passed in a name, so there's nothing that can be written out, except for, I guess you could say we could write out the actual value here, but we wouldn't have a name. So let's go back and fix that, and we can grab name from the controller that I showed a little bit earlier. In this case, the controller, just as a quick review, has a name or a customer property, I should say, which has name and street. So let's do customer.name. We want to pass that in to this. So we'll say name equals. Now, if I put customer.name like this, it's going to treat it like a literal string, and that's the value that'll be passed in. Of course, I want the actual property value, not the literal string. So we'll go ahead and add our data binding expression. All right, so name would have to be documented, of course. If you're writing a directive, you might have to have a little bit of documentation to say, hey, this is what I expect for my properties. And now, though, when we run it, we should get a simple value written out. Be very basic, but you can see it works. We get David written out. Now, just to kind of prove the concept, let's go back into here, and let's do the literal value that we see here. And let me switch back over to the browser now. Let's refresh it, and notice it just passed in the literal string, and that kind of proves what the at local scope property does. It just allows a string to be passed in. In fact, let's, as one more quick demo, let's try to just pass customer, but let's do it as an object, since customer is not just a basic property here. So let's switch back over. And you'll notice that it did allow the object to be passed, but probably not what you were after. It actually passed it as a JSON type string, you can see. And so that's exactly what the at local scope property does. If we go back into the directive to wrap up here, you can see that the at allows us to pass a string value. Now, if for some reason you actually don't want the user of your directive to use name, you instead want them to, do full name, let's just call it, then I could do this. Now, I personally don't like to do this because I think it kind of convolutes the matter a little bit. This is going to be what the outside world can pass in. This is their property. So we'd have to come back to here, and this would become, well, actually, and you got to be really careful. I'm just going to do full name because when you start doing the casing, you have to go back to the dash type thing. So I'm just going to keep it lowercase, and let's change that to lower, because you can definitely hit some problems there with naming where you'd think it'd work, but you got to remember that every time the camel hump type thing goes, it's actually you should be putting dashes. So I'm just going to leave it like this. Now, that allows the outside world to use full name, but internally, we're going to use name. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not a huge fan of this type of approach. Let's go customer.name so we can get back to what we want. It does work, and there are certainly use cases for this where You can see it still works. Where I need to have it named differently externally than internally, for whatever reason. That's what you would do right there. So let me go back into the editor. Let's just go back to name. I would recommend, especially as you're starting out with this, to just keep it like this. All right, by default, if you just put the @ then this will be the property that they'll use. And that would be an example of kind of several different ways you can use the @ local scope property.